The man pulled into the parking lot, and Cameron was already laughing before the engine cut out. A beat-up old car, paint peeling in broad patches, hood speckled with rust spots that caught the morning light like open wounds. It looked like something dragged from a salvage yard on a dare. The man stepped out late 30s, work boots, jeans with a worn-out knee, and lifted a 6-year-old boy down from the passenger seat, a boy clutching a thick picture book full of vintage cars. Cameron had said what he said loud enough for the whole showroom to hear. But 20 minutes later, the most powerful woman in the global luxury car collecting world was standing in that same parking lot, in front of that same battered old car, and she asked only one question. She asked it quietly, almost to herself. She asked, "Who built this?" If you want to know what happened when she got her answer, stay right here, because what followed will change the way you look at every quiet, ordinary person you have ever underestimated. Mason Hale was up at 6 that Saturday morning, same as every other morning. His garage was small, one bay, one overhead light, a radio older than most of the tools on his pegboard, and it smelled the way garages are supposed to smell, oil and metal, and something faintly like purpose. He was lying on his back under a neighbor's Ford pickup when Theo padded in from the house in his socks, the worn picture book already tucked under one arm and a half-eaten piece of toast in his free hand. Theo was 6 years old, and he knew the names of more vintage automobiles than most grown men who worked in dealerships. He had learned them the way children learn anything that lives close to something they love, by osmosis, by repetition, by sitting next to his father in a small garage for as long as he could remember and listening. Mason slid out from under the truck, sat up, and looked at his son. Theo's hair was going in 4 directions at once. He had toast crumbs on his chin. He was already pointing at a page in his book, ready to start the morning's first debate about whether the 1963 split-window Corvette was more beautiful than the 1967 Fastback. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag and said they had the whole day, no jobs, no calls. Theo looked up from the page and said he wanted to go see the nice cars. Mason already knew that was coming. It was what they did on Saturdays when the world left them alone, drove down to whatever showroom was open, stood in the cool, air-conditioned light, and looked at things they had no intention of buying. It was not about wanting. It had never been about wanting. It was about Theo getting to stand in front of something beautiful and recognize it, name it, understand it. Mason thought that was worth a Saturday morning every single time. He pulled a clean shirt from the shelf above his workbench, locked the house behind them, and helped Theo up into the passenger seat. The car was a 1966 Ford Galaxie 500, and it looked every one of its years from the outside. The paint, what remained of it, was a kind of dusty navy blue that had long since given up its gloss. The rear bumper had a small dent near the right corner that Mason had never bothered to pull out. The driver's side mirror had a thin crack running diagonally across its face, sealed with a bead of clear adhesive. The hood seam was slightly darker than the rest of the body, where a patch of primer had been exposed for so long it had developed its own weathering. To anyone passing it on the street, it was simply an old car that had not been taken care of. To Theo, it was the best car in the world, and this had been his settled opinion since he was old enough to form one. Theo patted the dashboard twice before he opened his book, the way he always did, the way you greet an old friend. Mason backed out of the driveway, and they drove toward Hargrove Prestige Motors without hurrying, Theo reading aloud the specifications for a 1957 Mercedes Gullwing, while the early light came slant and gold through the passenger window and lay across the boy's hands and the pages of his book. Mason drove with one wrist on the wheel and the radio playing something low, and he listened to his son recite displacement figures and horsepower ratings and original factory color codes, and he thought, not for the first time, that this was a very good way to spend a Saturday morning. Hargrove Prestige Motors occupied a 2-story glass building on the commercial strip that ran along the western edge of the city, and on a Saturday morning it had the polished, expectant quality of a stage set just before the curtain goes up. The marble floors had been buffed to a mirror shine. A fresh arrangement of white orchids stood on the reception counter. Staff moved quietly between the display vehicles, a dark green Bentley Continental, a black Maserati Gran Turismo, a steel blue Aston Martin DB. 12 at the center of the main floor like a sculpture installed for the express purpose of making people feel something. And every surface in the building had been brought to a state of readiness, for the VIP group scheduled to arrive that afternoon. Cameron stood near the north-facing windows with a small coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, and when the old Galaxy rolled into the guest parking bay outside, he turned to the colleague nearest him and said what he said. He said it the way people say things they have said 100 times before, things that have become reflexive, things that feel like wit, but are actually only habit. The habit of measuring a man by what he drives, and finding him wanting before he has had a chance to speak. The comment got its small laugh. Cameron straightened his jacket and waited. Mason came through the glass doors with Theo's hand in his. The boy saw the Aston Martin immediately, his whole face reorganized around it, mouth slightly open, eyes wide and working. He tugged Mason toward it without asking permission, pulling with that particular urgency that children reserve for things that exceed their expectations. Cameron crossed the floor at a measured pace, performing the approach, assessing as he walked. He took in the boots, the jeans, the faint trace of oil that no amount of hand washing ever quite removes from the skin of someone who works with their hands every day. He said they were welcome to look around, in a tone that did not mean that. When Theo reached out and laid one careful fingertip on the lower edge of the Maserati's door, not scratching, not pressing, just touching, the way a child touches a thing he has only seen in pictures, Cameron said, loudly enough, that the boy should keep his hands to himself. He said that people who were not buying should not be touching. He said it with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to do maximum damage with minimum words. Theo pulled his hand back. He looked up at his father with the expression children wear when the world has done something they do not yet have the vocabulary for. Mason knelt down to his son's level. He kept his voice even and quiet. He said that it was all right, that looking was enough. That looking was actually its own whole thing. Then he stood up, took Theo's hand again, and walked deeper into the showroom, as if nothing at all had happened. Cameron watched them go. He took out his phone and photographed the Galaxy through the window, where it sat in the parking lot, looking exactly like what it appeared to be, and he sent the photograph to the staff group with a caption and an emoji, and received back the small, validating laughter that these things are designed to produce. Mason stood in front of the Aston Martin DB12 for a long time. Not the way a man stands in front of something he wants, the way a man stands in front of a document he is reading. His eyes moved slowly along the door shut line, along the pressed edge where the front quarter panel met the hood, down to the lower sill where the body met the rocker. His father's eyes, his professional eyes, which he had never fully turned off even when he was trying to live a smaller, quieter life than the one he had trained for. He noticed, without particularly meaning to, that the door shut line on the rear passenger side was out by roughly 0.8 of a millimeter at its trailing edge. It was the kind of error that required specialized instruments to measure and years of experience to detect by sight. He noted it the same way he would note a slightly sharp note in music, not critically, just accurately, the way people with a trained ear cannot help hearing what they hear. What Cameron could not have known, standing in his showroom in his good jacket with his coffee growing cold, was what Mason had been before he became a man who drove an old Galaxy to a Saturday car show and let strangers talk down to him in front of his son. What Cameron did not know, because it was not written on Mason's boots, or his jeans, or the faint old oil in the creases of his knuckles, was that Mason Hale had spent the first decade of his working life as the lead restoration engineer at Pemberton and Vale Automotive Atelier, a private workshop outside London that took on the restoration projects that everyone else refused, not because the projects were undesirable, but because they were considered impossible. The kind of work that required not just technical precision but a quality that could not be taught or listed on a resume, the ability to look at a ruined, half-destroyed piece of automotive history and understand, at a cellular level, what it had originally been, and to bring it back to that state by force of knowledge and patience, and a kind of grief-adjacent love for the thing itself. Mason had rebuilt a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that had been 50% destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1971, a car that the restoration community had declared a total loss, beyond recovery, a project not worth beginning. Mason had spent 3 years and 7 months on it, working from partial factory records, period photographs, measurements taken from the one surviving sister car, and his own understanding of how Ferrari had worked in that era, the particular grammar of their panel construction, and their paint application, and their leather work. The car had sold at auction in Geneva for $11.4 million. The auction catalog had used the phrase, "miraculous recovery." Mason had used the phrase, "a lot of Saturday mornings." He had left Pemberton and Vale not because his career was finished, but because his wife was. Elena had been diagnosed late, the kind of late that closes off most roads. He had come home to Virginia, and he had been with her for the last 22 months of her life, sitting with her through the slow hours, driving her to appointments, reading to her in the evenings when the fatigue was too heavy for conversation. He had been as present as a person can be for another person, and it had not been enough to keep her, which was the one thing that no amount of skill or patience or love could correct. After she was gone, he had stayed because Theo was 3 years old and needed his father more than the restoration world needed Mason Hale. The workshop in London had written twice. He had not answered either letter. The garage in the back of a rented house in a quiet Virginia neighborhood was enough. The neighbor's pickup, the occasional referral from the local parts shop, the weekend Saturday drives with his son. He had made it be enough, and he had done this deliberately, with the same intentionality he brought to everything, because the alternative to want more, to reach for the work he was actually built for, and to do that alone had seemed, in those first years, like a second loss. He was not prepared to survive. The Range Rover that pulled into the Hargrove parking lot at 10:47 that morning was the color of obsidian and made almost no sound. It parked with the careful precision of a vehicle whose driver was accustomed to parking in places where being noticed arriving was part of the point. Violet Ashenfield stepped out and took the morning air in one measured breath, the way she took in most things completely, without waste. She wore a gray linen blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers, flat shoes that were expensive in the specific way that expensive things are, when they have stopped trying to announce themselves. The only piece of jewelry she wore was a watch on her left wrist, a Patek Philippe from 1962 that had belonged to her grandfather, the man who had founded Ashenfield Automotive Legacy 41 years ago, in a converted warehouse in Connecticut with 3 cars, a set of second-hand tools, and the conviction that the history of the automobile was worth preserving, the same way the history of painting was worth preserving. Carefully, completely, with the understanding that once something is truly gone, it is gone. Her grandfather had told her, when she was 8 years old and already obsessed, that the difference between a collector and a custodian was whether you understood that the car had existed before you and would outlast you, and your job was only to get it safely to the next person who deserved it. Violet had been operating from that principle for 31 years. Amelia, her senior assistant, came around from the passenger side with a tablet already open, already reading the afternoon schedule. Violet nodded once, which meant she had heard, and walked toward the showroom entrance without breaking stride. Xavier, the showroom manager, appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds after Violet's car had been visible from the reception desk, a feat of attentiveness that represented considerable effort and was received by Violet as nothing more than baseline professional courtesy. She shook his hand. She declined the offered champagne. She said she was here to look at the DB12 4th Series configuration and that she had 15 minutes. Xavier smiled with the particular intensity of a man trying not to visibly sweat and led her inside. Violet's entry into a room had a quality that was difficult to describe but easy to feel. It was not loudness, she was not a loud person. It was density, perhaps. The sense that the space she occupied was being assessed in real time with instruments too fine to see. Her eyes moved across the showroom floor in a single broad sweep. The vehicles, the staff positions, the lighting angles, the condition of the marble, and then she saw Theo. The boy was crouched in front of the Bentley's rear wheel arch, nose about 6 inches from the spoked alloy, reading in a low, deliberate voice from his picture book, the way children read when they are using the text, as a kind of anchor for something they are observing directly. Violet stopped walking for 1 full second. The sensation she registered was not sentiment exactly. It was more like recognition. She had been that child. She had been the child who showed up in places she technically belonged, because her grandfather had told her she belonged everywhere that cars were, and she had brought her book as proof of her credentials, and she had read the specifications aloud to whichever adult would stand still long enough to listen. She began walking again, and then she saw the galaxy. It was the morning light that did it. The sun had come around to the north-facing windows and was lying full across the parking lot at the particular low angle of a mid-morning Saturday, and in that light, the old navy blue paint of the galaxy caught something it would not have caught at noon or in shade or under the flat white light of a service bay. What it caught was the shape, the underlying shape of the panels, the way each surface curved into the next, with an evenness, a consistency, a continuity that did not belong to a 1966 assembly line and did not belong to any restoration shop that used filler and sanding blocks and an eye for good enough. Violet stood still. Amelia, who had been with her for 6 years, recognized the pause and stopped talking mid-sentence. Violet looked at the car for 11 seconds. Then she walked outside without telling anyone she was going. She stood in front of the Galaxy in the parking lot and did not touch it. She looked at the front quarter panel, the hood seam, the door face, the B-pillar, the rear quarter, the trunk lid. She crouched and looked at the rocker panel and the lower door edge. She stood and looked at the windshield surround. Then she said, to no one in particular, in the tone she used when she was thinking out loud, "That is hand-formed. That is all hand-formed." Amelia said her name once, quietly. Violet said nothing. She walked back into the showroom and looked at Xavier and asked him whose car was parked outside in the lot. The Galaxy, navy blue, the old one. Xavier did not know. He looked at Cameron. Cameron, who still had not processed the geometry of what was happening, said it belonged to some guy who had come in with his kid. He used a tone that, in the silence that followed, sounded like what it was. Violet looked at Cameron for 1.5 seconds, with no expression at all, which was somehow worse than any expression she could have worn. Then she asked where the man was. Mason was at the back of the showroom. Theo had fallen asleep against his shoulder sometime in the last 10 minutes. The particular sudden sleep of children who have been excited and are now crashing from it, and Mason was standing with his son's weight against him, holding Theo with one arm, looking at the technical specifications sheet framed beside the Aston Martin. Not the price, the specifications. He was reading the torque curve data with the quiet absorption of a man who finds this genuinely interesting. He heard her footsteps and looked up. She was not the kind of person you looked away from quickly. She said her name and asked if the Galaxy outside was his. He said yes. She asked who had restored it. He said he had. There was a pause, not awkward, not empty, but the kind of pause that happens when someone is rapidly recalibrating based on new information. Then Violet Ashenfield said she had been looking at hand-formed automotive bodywork for 31 years, and she could count on one hand the craftsmen who could produce a door panel radius of that consistency using only Prostat bark, traditional English wheel and hammer technique. She said one of the 2 people she knew who could do it at that level had died 8 months ago. She said the other had worked at Pemberton and Vale. She said, "Your name is Mason Hale." It was not quite a question. Theo stirred at that moment. He did not fully wake. He opened his eyes to a slit, looked at the unfamiliar woman with the expensive watch, looked at his father, and then pressed his face back into Mason's shoulder without a word. Mason said quietly that he should sleep, and the boy did. Violet watched this without commentary. Mason confirmed his name. She said she knew about the Ferrari 250 GTO. She said she knew about the Nakamura offer in 2018, the Bugatti Type 57 Atlantic, $4 million to produce a high-quality replica. She said she knew he had declined. Mason said that he did not make fakes. Violet said she knew that too, and that it was, in fact, the reason she was standing here talking to him rather than talking to any of the other people who had been on her list for the past 2 years. From somewhere near the reception desk came a small sound Cameron, setting a glass down with slightly too much force. Xavier, standing nearby, turned and looked at Cameron with an expression that required no translation. Violet did not look at either of them. She kept her eyes on Mason, and then she looked once, briefly, at the Galaxy through the showroom glass. She asked how long it had taken him to build it. He said, 4 years. She asked if he had worked alone. He said that Theo had been there from when the boy was 2 years old, sitting on the workbench, then on the floor, then on a stool that Mason had cut down to the right height. He did not explain what the car meant, and she did not ask him to. She asked if he would sell it. He said no. She said she would pay any price he named. He said the car did not have a price. She looked at him. He looked back. Then Theo, half asleep, mumbled from somewhere in the folds of Mason's shirt that she could not buy the car because his dad built it for him. The showroom went as quiet as a building can go when it still has air conditioning running and someone is still polishing something in the back. Violet looked at the boy for a moment. She said nothing. Then, for the first time in the conversation, the corner of her mouth moved. Cameron's full understanding of what had happened arrived in stages. The way bad news always arrives first, the fact, then the context, then the weight of the context pressing down on everything that had felt light and easy only an hour before. It arrived via his phone, via the staff group chat, where someone had found a link, a Rob Report feature from 2019, 4 pages, illustrated with photographs, headlined, "The Ghost Restorer, How One American Engineer Rebuilt a Ferrari No One Else Could Touch." There was a photograph of Mason, younger, standing in a London workshop in front of a cherry-red Ferrari 250 GTO, tool in hand, the kind of smile that appears on a person's face when they have finished something that should not have been possible. Cameron stood in the middle of the showroom floor with his phone in his hand and read the article in pieces. He read about Geneva. He read the $11.4 million figure. He read a quote from the Reinhardt Collection's director that said, simply, "We believed it was gone. We were wrong." He read a paragraph near the end of the piece in which a professor of automotive history at a British university described Mason Hale's approach to restoration as representing a standard of fidelity that the profession might not see again for a generation. Cameron scrolled back to the photograph. The man in the photo wore the same kind of jeans, the same kind of boots. He was standing in front of a car worth more than most buildings Cameron would ever walk into, and he looked like someone who had simply been doing his work and was glad it was finished. Cameron looked up from his phone and looked across the showroom at Mason, who was sitting now in one of the guest chairs near the coffee station, Theo still drowsing against his arm, the picture book sliding off the boy's knees. Mason was not looking at Cameron. Mason was not looking at anyone in particular. He was doing what he had been doing all morning, which was being entirely, quietly present for his son in the way of a man who does not require an audience for the things that matter to him most. Cameron felt something specific that he did not have an easy word for, not quite shame, not quite guilt, something more structural, like the floor shifting slightly under a weight it had not expected. Xavier appeared at his shoulder and asked him to come to the back. Cameron put his phone in his pocket and went. Violet's actual meeting, the one Xavier had been preparing for since 8 in the morning, was brief and conducted in a corner of the showroom at a table that the staff had set with water and a small plate of things. No one touched. Amelia sat to Violet's right. Mason sat across from her. Theo, now fully awake, and having been led by Giselle, one of the junior floor staff, the only person in the building who had treated the boy with uncomplicated kindness from the moment he walked in, crouching down to show him things, letting him ask questions to look at the Rolls-Royce Cullinan parked near the side wall. Violet spoke plainly, the way she always spoke, as if she had decided long ago that the time spent on preamble was time stolen from the conversation itself. She explained the Heritage Project, a traveling exhibition of restored vintage automobiles, 27 cities across 3 continents, over 3 years, representing the most significant vehicles in post-war automotive history. 6 cars still needed to be restored from incomplete original condition chassis work, body forming, interior reconstruction, mechanical rebuilding. 3 were in London, 2 in Stuttgart, 1 in Kyoto. She had been trying for 24 months to identify a master restorer who could take the project on. She had a short list of 4 names. 3 had already been hired by museum programs or private collectors who could offer more stability. The 4th had left the industry. She had come to Hargrove that morning to look at a DB12 for a client. The Galaxy had not been part of her plan. She said this last thing without apology or sentimentality, in the way that someone describes a fact. She asked if Mason would take the position of Master Restorer for the Heritage Project. 3-year contract. He would choose his workspace, set his working conditions, build whatever team he needed. Travel limited to a maximum of 4 trips per year, no trip exceeding 2 weeks. His name on all official documentation, all exhibition materials, all catalog entries. Salary by his proposal, not hers. Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water glass. He said he had a 6-year-old son. She said she knew. He said the boy needed his father at home. She said she had designed the working conditions with that in mind. He said he needed to think about it. She said of course. She took a card from the inside pocket of her jacket. Heavy stock, single color, name and phone number, nothing else, and placed it on the table. She said there was no deadline. She stood. She added, without particular emphasis, almost as a closing observation, a man who spends 4 years rebuilding an old car alone, not to sell it, not to show it, just because it needed doing, that man needs to be working. Not at the level he has been working. She looked at the galaxy one final time through the glass. Then she walked out. The afternoon moved slowly through the showroom, the way afternoons do when the main thing has already happened. Violet's Range Rover left the parking lot without ceremony. The VIP group arrived at 2 in the afternoon and was led through the vehicles by Xavier, who performed his role with the professional smoothness of a man who has had time to compose himself and has made excellent use of it. He described horsepower figures and bespoke color options, and the lead times for special configurations with the particular fluency that high-end sales requires the ability to talk about money as though it were simply a unit of measurement, like centimeters or degrees, without any of the freight that money actually carries. Cameron was present and professional, and did not make unnecessary conversation. He sold a deposit on a Maserati to a man in a blue suit who had not needed much persuading, and he completed the paperwork with accuracy and care. And he was polite to the man's wife when she asked questions about the interior color options. He was doing his job. He would continue to do his job. But something had been recalibrated that morning in a way that did not have an off switch, and Cameron was aware of it as a kind of low, persistent hum beneath the ordinary sounds of the afternoon. A reminder that arrived each time he walked past the north-facing window and saw the empty parking space where the galaxy had been. He crossed paths with Mason once by the coffee station, where Mason was standing with Theo and waiting for a water for the boy. Cameron stopped. He did not offer a speech. He said that he had been wrong, and that he was sorry to Mason, and to the boy. That was all. Mason looked at him. He said he knew. There was a pause between them that was neither hostile nor warm, but honest, and then it was over, and Cameron moved away. What had happened between them was small in the architecture of the larger day, but it was real, and Mason registered it as such, and let it be what it was. Giselle brought Theo a cup of water and a wrapped candy from the reception dish, and Theo said thank you with great seriousness, and Giselle laughed. Mason watched his son accept this small kindness and offer it back in the form of a 6-year-old's formal gratitude, and he thought, as he often thought when watching Theo interact with the world, that Elena had given the boy something, some basic warmth, some ease with other people that Mason had never quite managed to install in himself, and that this was perhaps the most important restoration project he had ever been involved in, even if he had done relatively little of the work. They left at 3:30. Theo walked out ahead of Mason, moving toward the galaxy with the purposeful energy of a child who has saved up energy all afternoon and is now releasing it. He broke into a short run for the last few steps and slapped both palms flat against the passenger door, the way he always did. Not rough, not careless, but decisive, greeting the car the way he greeted the garage and the workbench and his father's shoulder. As a familiar and beloved thing, Mason unlocked the doors and lifted Theo in, and then stood for a moment by the driver's side in the afternoon light, one hand on the roof of the car. The paint was warm from the sun. He could feel, through his palm, the slight, imperceptible topography of the metal beneath the hand-worked surface that no machine process and no filler compound would ever replicate, the evidence of 4 years of Saturday mornings and Wednesday evenings, and the occasional all-night session when Theo was asleep and the work would not wait. He had never thought of it as a masterpiece, He had thought of it as a thing that needed to be done correctly, for its own sake, and for the sake of a boy who had told him, when Theo was 4 years old and Mason had explained what he was doing and why, that the car looked like something from a fairy tale. He had kept the old paint because of that. He had kept the dents and the cracked mirror and the worn chrome. He had done the invisible work and left the visible wear, because the truth of the thing was inside, and the inside was for the two of them. That night, after Theo was asleep, the picture book face down on his chest, his breathing slow and even, the small nightlight by the door, casting its familiar warm circle on the wall. Mason sat in the garage on the stool he had cut down to Theo's height and had never raised back up. The overhead light was on. Violet's card was on the workbench between a number 12 wrench and a jar of metal polish. He looked at it. The card had her name and a phone number. That was all. He thought about Elena. He thought about a specific evening, not long after they had moved back to Virginia, when Elena had been having a good day, one of the good days, when the fatigue lifted enough for her to come out to the garage and sit in the old folding chair he kept there for exactly that purpose. She had watched him work on the Galaxy's door frame, just sitting, not saying anything, and after a while she had said that she did not understand what he was doing, but she loved watching him do it. He had taken her hand and placed it on the bare metal panel and let her feel the surface he had been working. She had moved her fingers slowly across it and not said anything, and that silence had been the best review anything he had ever made had received. She had said one other thing, in those last months, that he had carried with him like a flat stone in a pocket. She had told him not to stop, not to make himself smaller for the sake of grief or guilt or the particular temptation to disappear into a manageable life, because a manageable life could not hurt you the same way the real one could. She had said it gently, without drama, the way she said most true things. He had promised her. He was not entirely sure, in the years since, whether he had kept that promise as fully as she had meant it. He looked at the Galaxy. 4 years. Alone, mostly. The English wheel from a retired coach builder in Maryland, who had given it to him for almost nothing because he recognized, in Mason, someone who would use it correctly. The leather for the interior sourced from a tannery in northern England that still processed hides the way they had in the 1950s, the same supplier the original factory would have used. The engine rebuilt to Concours standard, which meant not just functioning correctly, but functioning as it had functioned on the day it left the factory, with the same tolerances, the same sounds, the sound a well-made engine makes, when everything is exactly where it is supposed to be. He had done all of this in a small garage in Virginia while raising a son alone and answering calls about neighbors' pickups and lawn tractors. He had done it because it needed doing, and because Theo had been there watching, and because Elena had asked him not to stop. He sat for a long time without deciding anything. Then he turned off the light, but he did not go inside yet. He stood in the dark of the garage with his hand resting on the Galaxy's roof, listening to the sound of the neighborhood at night. A dog somewhere, a car passing on the road 2 blocks over, and through the small window that connected the garage to the house, the almost inaudible sound of his son breathing in sleep. He tapped the roof once, lightly, the way he always did with a car he had made, letting it know he was there, letting it know he knew it. Sunday came in cool and low-lit, the sky the color of old aluminum. Mason was already in the garage when Theo woke up not working, just sitting on the cut-down stool with a cup of coffee, looking at the Galaxy the way you look at something when you are trying to see it clearly, rather than the way you usually see it. Theo appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, hair still in its overnight chaos, and climbed up onto the stool next to Mason without asking, which meant there was barely enough room for both of them, and neither of them moved to make more. Theo looked at the car, and then looked at his father. He asked what Mason was thinking about. Mason said he was thinking about whether he wanted to build more cars. Theo considered this and asked what kinds of cars. Mason said the very old kind, the very valuable kind, the kind that lived in museums. Theo looked at the Galaxy for a moment, with the evaluative seriousness that he brought to most things. Then he said that no car was better than their car. Mason laughed, not the small, polite laugh of a man going through the motions, but a real one, unexpected, the kind that starts in the chest. He reached over and adjusted the collar of Theo's pajama top, which had been folded in on itself. He stood up. He picked up Violet's card from the workbench and looked at it one last time in the morning light. Then he put it in the front pocket of his shirt. He said they were going for breakfast first, and that he would tell Theo everything on the way back. Theo jumped down from the stool, seized his father's hand, and pulled toward the door. Mason let himself be pulled. They went out through the side door, and the garage door rolled down behind them, and the Galaxy stood alone in the quiet interior, with the morning coming gray and soft through the high window, and lying across the old paint, in a way that showed to anyone with the kind of eyes that knew what to look for, that beneath the rust and the faded color and the patient accumulation of years, every panel on that car was exactly where it was supposed to be, shaped by a man who understood that the difference between something ordinary and something extraordinary was not a matter of materials or money or time alone, but of the intention you brought to it, and the willingness to do the invisible work without needing anyone to see it done.